The prayer I want to start today is with Zbigniew Herbert, the great Polish poet. Poland, as you know, is basically where the 20th century happened, with little minor interruptions elsewhere. Certainly World War I and World War II were fought primarily in Poland and Belarus and a few other places, with things like Normandy and Italy being complete sideshows. At any rate, millions and millions and millions of Poles and Jews in Poland and Ukrainians in Belarus, Russians died in both world wars, Ukraine in the famines and so forth. And a general conversation that often goes on in Poland is you know, let's forget about this. Can we move on? How many people exactly died? Who knows? Let's just move on. And Zbigniew Herbert, one of the great Polish poets, had a alter ego named Mr. Cogito. And in this poem, there are many poems of Mr. Cogito on different subjects, and this one is Mr. Cogito on the need for precision. Mr. Cogito is alarmed by a problem in the domain of applied mathematics, the difficulties we encounter with operations of simple arithmetic. Children are lucky. They add apple to apple, subtract grain from grain. The sum is correct. The kindergarten of the world pulsates with a safe warmth. Particles of matter have been measured, heavenly bodies weighed, and only in human affairs inexcusable carelessness reigns supreme, the lack of precise information. Over the immensity of history wheels a specter, the specter of indefiniteness. How many Greeks were killed at Troy? We don't know. To give the exact casualties on both sides in the Battle of Gaugamela, at Agincourt, Leipzig, Kutno, and also the number of victims of the terror, of the white, the red, the brown, colors, innocent colors. We don't know. We really don't know. Mr. Cogito rejects the sensible explanation that this was long ago, the wind has thoroughly mixed the ashes, the blood flowed to the sea. Sensible explanations intensify the alarm of Mr. Cogito. Because even what is happening under our eyes evades numbers, loses the human dimension. Somewhere there must be an error, a fatal defect in our tools, or a sin of memory. 2. A few simple examples from the accounting of victims. In an airplane disaster, it's easy to establish the exact number of the dead, important for heirs and those plunged into grief, for insurance companies. We take the list of the passengers and the crew, and next to each name we place a little cross. It's slightly harder in the case of train accidents. Bodies torn to pieces had to be put back together, so no head remains ownerless. During elemental catastrophes, the arithmetic becomes complicated. We count those who are saved, but the unknown remainder, neither alive nor definitely dead, is described by a strange term, the missing. They still have a chance to return to us from fire, from water, from the interior of the earth. If they return, that's fine. If they don't, too bad. 3. Now Mr. Cogito climbs to the highest tottering step of indefiniteness. How difficult it is to establish the names of all those who perished in the struggle with inhuman power. The official statistics reduce their number once again pitilessly. They decimate those who have died a violent death, and their bodies disappear in abysmal cellars of huge police buildings. Eyewitnesses blinded by gas, deafened by salvos, by fear and despair, are inclined toward exaggeration. Accidental observers give doubtful figures, accompanied by that shameful word, about. And yet, in these matters, accuracy is essential. We must not be wrong even by a single one. Ignorance about those who have disappeared undermines the reality of the world. Ignorance about those who have disappeared undermines the reality of the world. It thrusts into the hell of appearances the devilish net of dialectics, proclaiming there is no difference between the substance and the specter. Therefore, we have to know to count exactly, call by first name, provide for a journey, in a bowl of clay, millet, poppy seeds, a bone comb, arrowheads, and a ring of faithfulness, amulets. And then before turning to Susan Sheehan, I also wanted to talk, where's my words, a bit about Rembrandt's painting over here, which you all know by heart. You've seen 1,000 times. Close your eyes for a second. Don't look at it. Stop looking. As we know, this is a painting of a professor who is teaching his class anatomy. There is a naked, virtually naked man whose arm has been opened up. There's a pile of people, onlookers. Some of them are looking out at us, but the central group is looking at one thing in particular. As you know, the anatomist has the flayed arm open. That's the thing that we're looking at. But that central group is looking completely drop-jawed, amazed at the thing that I'm talking about. And the question is, what are they looking at? Don't look yet. I mean, I think most people, certainly in my memory is that they're looking at the flayed arm. Now look at it. Now open your eyes. They are completely dumbfounded at the professor who is saying, with that muscle, you can do this. They are looking completely astonished at the professor's hand. They're looking at it like they've never seen anything like it. And if you think about it, this is a painting about, not so much about death, but about vision and about malleability, manipulability, which is to say it's a painting about painting, for one thing. Imagine at one point Rembrandt was painting the hand of the professor and had these guys looking at him painting. It must have been quite a moment for him. By the way, art historians are very silly. Art historians will tell you that what they're looking at is that book. There have been books written about how they're looking at that book, which is just the kind of thing that a book writer would say, but no, they're not looking at that book. They are looking at the hand, which is to say that this is a painting about life and not about death. One of the things also that's, by the way, very interesting about this painting, if you look closely, let me go. Let me get up here, and I want to zoom in on something. You know that when they dissected, it was always thieves who were the ones who were dissected, thieves or murderers or something. In this case, it was a thief, and we know that because if you look at the hand that is there, as you see it definitely when you're actually in Amsterdam, you see it. That hand is a different color slightly, and it's because the way he originally painted it, we know from X-rays, is with the hand chopped off, which is what they did to thieves. And that would have made it even more obvious that this was a painting about hands and so forth. He then must have, for some reason, painted it back in. But the real star of this painting is that. It is the marvel of human life, of art, and so forth, notwithstanding the presence of death. If this were a completely different talk, I would go on to talk to you about Christ, and then I'd also explain to you why this is the painting that is the reason that you see Che Guevara on T-shirts, but that's a different lecture. I did include, in fact, include it on the readings. If you want to, you can read a piece I wrote about that. Anyway, having said that, we'll leave that aside. And you'll understand that I raised that because as a backdrop to talking about a chapter that I had you read in A Missing Plane. Well, those of you who had a chance, how many had a chance to read it? What do you think? I warned you, it wouldn't be easy. Our naysayer, what did you think?
I think that she makes last week's reading seem like stand-up comedy.
There's that.
Like what?
Like stand-up comedy.
Like the theology stuff is compared to having so long like old stories. I gotta say, I'm appreciative of it without having read every word, because after a while, I like the fact that it was done and it exists, but I realized that even if I marked with every bone, I would retain almost none of it, but now I know where to find it if I ever need it.
Okay. Others, yeah. Well, Faroe, uh-huh. Mm-hmm. So she liked Faroe and was disturbed that he wasn't there at the end, yeah? Uh-huh. Other people have responses? Yeah.
I think the story of the piece about meticulousness and importance of composing order, something had to be done this way. It couldn't have not been so painstakingly and at times well.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thought is that observations through his reactions to the fact that his face is 21st birthday.
Uh-huh.
Little nuggets buried in like mounds and mounds of X gashes that I'm barely capable of retaining in a sense of all of it. There's some stunning.
So there are these stunning moments, although it is a slog. There is gold in them. In that slogging. Well, let me, by the way, begin by giving you a backdrop to this. First of all, I should say this was published, I believe, in 1982, 83 in the New Yorker, or 80, I guess maybe 84. Which is to say, and it's astonishing to think about this, that there was a period roughly between 75 and 85 when Vietnam fell off the map. Nobody talked about it. It was just not, and the people who died in Vietnam weren't talked about. It will only be in the middle of the Reagan administration that that Maya Lin's monument will be inaugurated, and that will be a subject of huge controversy at the time, very much opposed as it's first being put in. But the point is that it's not possible to talk about Vietnam during that first 10 years. And this is a piece that's very consciously in that world and shine in the same way that last time I talked to you about the way that rather than do the Brooklyn Bridge, we did the Holland Tunnel. Here, rather than confront Vietnam directly, it does keep showing up constantly in the piece. There's that. In the case of Susan Sheen, it's especially remarkable because her husband is Neil Sheen, and Neil Sheen and David Halberstam were the two great New York Times reporters in 62, 63 who were warning that things were going off the rails, and they both came back in 64 and started writing. And Halberstam, of course, writes The Best and the Brightest and so forth. But everybody knows that Neil Sheen is writing the truly great book about Vietnam, and he's in the middle of working on it. It's taking forever for him to do. And suddenly he has a terrible car accident. I'm pretty sure it was a car accident. And he has brain damage. And he's slowed down. And at that point, he was writing this thing, which everybody was talking about as the Moby Dick of Vietnam. And now he was kind of sidelined for several years. And his wife, Susan Sheehan, took to journalism, but more or less to support the family. And one of the things that's completely amazing about Susan, this is what Susan Sheehan looks like. I mean, she's Ozzie and Harriet or something. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. And she, the first thing she does, she turns out to be this insane, and I'm talking borderline maniacal reporter. The first thing she does is about a prisoner, and she does this treatment to a prisoner, this incredible, and the New Yorker runs this incredible profile of a prisoner. She then does a welfare mother, incredible piece. She will subsequently be doing this incredible piece about schizophrenic called Is There No Place on Earth for Me, which is equally amazing. We can talk about that later. But in the middle of all this, she does this piece here. And as I mentioned to you last time, it begins with the first part is in the jungle, finding this stuff. You have no idea why, and it's only by the end you begin to realize that they found these piles of bones and they sent them to Hawaii. And then we pick up at this point here. I think maybe I'll just go directly into a somewhat close reading of it, just to kind of bring out some things that I think are interesting about it, and maybe try to convince you that it's not quite as hopeless as you think it is. I'm on the first page, on page 43. She right away says that, you know, we're in this place that has we're in this place in Honolulu where they take care of the bodies. Bodies coming from Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. So right away on the first page, you know what the subtext of this is. And now she goes on. You keep on having these. I'm just looking just up ahead on page 45. Most medical supply firms in the United States acquire specimens in India. I mean, just that's an example of these weird kind of things that pop out. You're like, that's weird. The difference in appearance between the lab specimens on 45 and the bones that Stewart had laid out on the 18 stretchers was quite comparable to the difference between the B-24 when it took off from Port Moresby on March 22nd, 1944 for Nazab, and the B-24 less than half an hour later. Let's put it mildly. We do meet, on 47, we meet Tadue Furue, bottom paragraph, Tadue Furue, a Japanese citizen who was 57 years old in May 1982. I assume all of you did what I did. You are subtracting 57 from 82, right? In which case you discover that he was born in 1925, in which case you realize he was 16 years old at the time of Pearl Harbor, at which point all sorts of things begin to occur to you. If I were to ask you, what is this book about? What is this chapter about in a sentence?
Reminds me a lot of German scientists who built the bomb.
You know, German scientists, although this is the opposite. This is not German scientists who built the bomb. This is about a man who has such incredible devotion to the task of salvaging the past, of you know, ignorance about those who have disappeared undermines the reality of the world. This is a man, this is almost a saintly man, who is working in Pearl Harbor, the place that his ancestors attacked, that started the war, that led to the fact that this plane was taking off one day to go and kill him. This is a Japanese citizen. This is, by the way, not a Japanese American. We're not talking about any of that stuff. This is a guy who was in Japan through the whole war, who survived all the, and it will become clearer and clearer as we're going along, that he survived all the fire bombings and so on and so on. And yet, there's this, I mean, right there, this becomes this incredible, and I would suggest to you that it's thrumming just below the surface of this whole reading experience. And is, I mean, it's operatic. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing what's happening on the, I mean, and one of the things I love about her is that she never says it. She just kind of keeps on laying it out. It'll come up in all kinds of different places, but this is an incredibly emotional thing that's happening. Don't ever for a minute forget that these 22 people were going to kill him if they could have. Just as his parents were eager to kill everybody in Pearl Harbor. You know, I mean, yeah. Yep, his father spoke better English. There's all kinds of just amazing stuff going on, flowing back and forth here. And, you know, it says, and by the way, this is all taking place once again in the context of Vietnam, which is not being talked about. And an interesting question all the way through here is, do we have anywhere near, can you imagine any of us doing for Vietnamese what this guy was doing for the Americans who wanted to kill him and so forth? That's a subtext. Anyway, he goes on the next page. He only moves to Hawaii in 1977, so he's been in Japan up until, you know, 5 years before this thing is happening, right? He's a completely Japanese person. Anyway, so he's talking about what it's like, and one of the things that this is going to be about. This is one of the best pieces of writing you can get about reporting. This is what being a reporter is like. By the way, I think maybe I'll do right now and blow your mind and let you know that she was not present at any of the what she's describing. She first became aware of all this when she saw that headline She was vacationing in Colorado Springs. She saw that headline, which is to say they've identified all the bodies. And when she came back to the New Yorker, she went to Sean and showed him that headline, and he said, okay, which was as much as to say, take as long as you need, figure out how you want to do it. You're on an expense account for any amount of traveling you need to do. But the point is, this entire thing you read is reported after the fact. She was not there for the actual stuff that Ferrari was doing. It's in itself pretty amazing. Anyway, he says at one point on 48, you can't look at shattered bones and either panic or mentally give up. You have to tell yourself that it may take weeks or months to piece the fragments together and fit loose teeth into the proper sockets. It takes time to put a puzzle together. I think of my work as solving a high-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Susan Sheen is talking about porting. She's talking about having all this information on the table and figuring out how to report it. And so you're going to have a meta-reporting going on through the whole reportage that's going on here. And it can be extremely, there are points where it's literally one on top of the other. But so it goes on, and you begin to get all the X4s and the X7s and so forth and so on. Now, one of the things, let's remember, these talks that I'm giving are about form, the first two that I've been giving, the last one. Last week I told you that the form of the McPhee piece was a debris slide. It was all that information coming at you. And then we had that whole thing about the musket and how he used that to form that material. And in the case of the Sandy Frazier, it was the closest point between two parts of Manhattan, but then it became about tunneling and what it's like inside of a tunnel. The piece, again, was, the form was the chaoticness of the land, the burrowedness, the deep, pressure of the barometric pressure, and then the explosion of America on the far side of that piece, that was the form. In those senses, what is the form of this piece? It's on page 52 at the bottom. The skeleton is the body's internal framework. Its primary function is that of support. Just as beams hold up buildings, the skeleton holds the human body erect. Unlike buildings, however, the body doesn't stay still. The form of this piece is a skeleton, is building a skeleton. Is putting a skeleton back together. But in particular, what's fascinating about this stuff is that the language of describing how skeletons work is all language about words in his reading of the bones. At one point, an elbow articulates. When the elbow does this, it articulates. And the articulation of these bones is going to be what this piece is about. The whole piece is going to be about building the whole thing, and then halfway through, suddenly, it's going to go out the other way, and it will begin to move. It will articulate into the world. But it reminds me of a nice passage I'll read you. Actually, two nice passages. One of them is from Barry Unsworth's novel, Sacred Hunger. Have any of you read that? Completely fantastic novel about the slave trade. Completely mind-blowing in terms of nothing you think you know about the slave trade is true. It's incredibly strange stuff. But he has this one wonderful, Barry Unsworth, he has this wonderful thing where he's describing the work on a ship. You don't need to know that it's a slave ship. It's true of any ship. Work on the ship continued. She rose on her stocks from day to day, proceeding by ordained stages from notion to form. Like any work of the imagination, she had to maintain herself against disbelief, guard her purpose through metamorphoses that made her barely recognizable at times. Indeed, she had looked more herself in the early stages of the building, with the timbers of the keel laid in place and scarfed together to form her backbone, and the stem and the stern post jointed to it. Then she had already the perfect dynamic of her shape, the perfect declaration of her purpose. But with the attachment of the vertical frames, which conform to the design of the hull and so define the shape of it, she looked a botched, disheveled thing. Any of you who've written anything know that stage. It starts out looking like it's supposed to, but then it becomes totally botched, disheveled. With the raw planks standing up loose all round her. Then slowly she was gripped into shape again, clamped together by the transverse beams running athwart her and the massive wales that girdled her fore and aft. She was riveted and fastened with oak trenails and wrought iron bolts driven through the timbers and clenched, and so she began to look herself again, as is the gradual way of all art. What a fantastic paragraph. And by the way, in terms of what we're doing here, you've got the 22, we start with 22 stretchers, which is what we're going to end up with, and so forth, but then we just get into total messiness, and then eventually we float out. There's a great poem by Kay Ryan, which is almost the same poem told from the opposite point of view, called "We're Building the Ship as We Sail It." The first fear being drowning, the ship's first shape was a raft, which was hard to unflatten after that didn't happen. It's awkward to have to do one's planning in extremis in the early years. So hard to hide later, sleekening the hull, making things look a little more gracious. Anyway, coming back to this. The point I was making is that in many ways, once again, the form of the piece is a skeleton, and a skeleton is about identity, and it's about looking for identity, shaping identity, and then once you've formed it, making it begin to move. At one level, just talking about reporting very quickly here, one of the things I sometimes say about reporting is that reporting is seeing with your ears. It's really looking at what you hear. In the same way that reading is hearing with your eyes, is using your eyes to make out a voice. In this sense, if I were teaching the class I teach on voice, which I usually teach after these classes on form, a voice is that form is the larynx of the piece. And voice is what happens when you breathe through the larynx. So these different so that the Sandy Fraser piece, when you breathe through the chaos of Canal Street or through the hollow of the tunnel, or in this case, what it is to breathe through to get the skeleton to come alive, which is what this whole exercise is. Anyway, so on the next page, we're 53 here. At the bottom, as high school student, Furuy had planned to be an engineer, but after seeing modern times, I love this detail, after seeing Charlie Chaplin in Japan, in what it would have been because he was in high school, he was going to be an engineer, but so 16, 17 years old, he sees Charlie Chaplin while the war may have already started. Charlie Chaplin's satirical movie about the dehumanizing effects of technology. He decided he wanted to work in a profession that was less mechanical. Remains like X5 always makes him glad he chose to become a physical anthropologist. "I'm bewitched by the beauty of bones," he often says. "They're not mass-produced cast material. Each set of bones has its own individuality." Or phrased differently, its own identity. "I'm bewitched by the beauty of bones." We also remember, in terms of reporting, he has his evil twin brother who he keeps on having to justify things to. You should all, if you're going to be reporters, have your evil twin brother along. Anyway, so we continue on, and on 56, once again, the Vietnamese show up briefly. There's a mention that the Special Commission had been told that among the people buried in Van Diem were 250 civilians killed in the American bombing raids on Hanoi. Do we see any effort of this sort going on their behalf? Well, no, it's the Vietnamese who should do that. No, it's us who should do that. In this story, the Japanese do it. Guys doing it for us, but anyway. You get these insane moments that are half Tadoi Furuy being insane and half Susan Sheehan being insane. He estimated the ages of both individuals as being between 20 and 22, which is to say that he believed that they were at least 20 years old, but not yet reached their 23rd birthday. Well, thank you very much. Anyway, and then we begin to get into some serious bone stuff, eventually leading to the famous chart on page 63. Did any of you see the thing that he saw when he saw this chart? Yeah. Did you see that right away? What's interesting about it as a piece of work, first of all, Geis is the co-pilot. He's the smallest guy on the plane, just like the pilot is the tallest guy on the plane. I mean, this has all kinds of, stuff. This is the casting sheet for the Hollywood casting agency. We're going to need a tall guy to play we're going to need a short kid to play. So there's all that. But because of that happenstance, the most amazing thing on this chart is right there in the right-hand corner where you should be looking. I mean, even if you're just browsing, you might have noticed that. But most people don't. I didn't. And so it becomes a completely amazing thing that the next day when the next page when Ferrui wrote it down. When he wrote down Geis's age, he had thought how sad it was for a man to die on his 21st birthday. But anyway, so we're going along, and again, it's driving you crazy. It's more and more. And all that stuff about the teeth, which I actually, I must say, by the way, that I do read this every time before I teach it. So I've now read it 15 times or something. And it's a pretty amazing. This stuff doesn't get boring. I mean, it is kind of, I mean, you notice something new each time, and it is, and the obsessiveness is fascinating. But just these details are just kind of, how do human beings know all this stuff? It's really amazing. But
do you read the excessive detail as kind of Susan Sheehan reporting on like the way he insulates himself from like the tragedy that
or is Susan Sheehan insulating herself from the tragedy, including the tragedy of her husband? Or is, I mean, and does it insulate? Does it work? I mean, there's that. I mean, to do it for Ferrui is a maniac. I mean, the two of them together, it's just like heaven that they found each other. I mean, it's like it's really weird.
Just a question. Not having read anything else by it, is obsessiveness a through line?
It is a through line, and I've often said, I mean, there's several. There's what I call in the same way. There's the Sadian woman. There's the Shawnian woman. If your view of womankind was Pauline Kael, Susan Sheehan, Janet Malcolm, Renata Adler, I could go on. There's Penelope Gilliatt, a few others. You too would go out there and say, "Hello, Mr. Weschler. It's very good to meet you." These are scary people. if I heard that Janet Malcolm or Susan Sheehan were going to do a profile on me, I'd just jump out the window. I mean, these are really, really, and they happen to be among the greatest writers in the world and the greatest reporters, but they are just scary, especially Susan Sheehan is the outlier here. She is scary, scary thorough. I'll read you something else of hers a little bit to give you a sense, but this is a through line.
Does she write anything that's more ingratiating? Or is it all as the fortress writing?
The subjects sometimes are less. I mean, actually, the one about the schizophrenic is really, I'll read you a passage of that later on. The schizophrenic is quite amazing, and oddly enough, is much less rigorously logical. Or, phrased differently, is the most logical thing there is, because whatever the logic of the schizophrenic, what is barely holding her together is what the piece is about. But she has tended to do fairly dark subjects.
But she seems to be, I think some phrase or something about that original speaking has to do with comprehension. Like the price you have to pay to get what you get from something. And she almost seems to have asked for it.
I wouldn't be surprised if that were true. No, there is that quality of that intensity that's quite startling. Although once again, when you see her in person, she's this person. Hey, Mom, do you have the brownies yet? It's very strange. Somebody over here had their hand up? Yeah. Right. I mean, your point that basically this is a way of building up power and intensity, and I think it is, and I agree with you. Now it may turn out that there's just readers who are adept at who it has nothing to do with a good reader or a bad reader, but the readers whose temperament this goes with and who can sustain it, and others who just get repelled by it, and it doesn't work that way. But if it does work, it works spectacularly. I mean, it really, really slowly builds on you. And again, I think if you go into it continuously with this amazement that this is a Japanese guy doing this in Pearl Harbor, it's just, I mean, why this wasn't turned into a movie that night. I mean, the way it was published, people just like, God, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen, as a story. And it was very much her decision to do this way. I can easily see somebody doing it another way, which would have been much more foregrounding all these issues and so forth. But anyway, let's keep going here. So, you're on page 73 before he puts a red index card with Charles Barnard's name on stretcher X1. There's all that stuff about how, I don't know, it's here, it's later, where he not only has to prove that this is that person, but that none of the other people can be this person. But that actually is how reporting works. I mean, you don't have to be literally that crazy about it, but that certainly is something that when I'm out in the field reporting, I'm doing that, although not in this kind of, shall we call it, Aspergerian way. I mean, anyway, so then you're moving on, and he's now going from the teeth to the whole body. And at the bottom of 75, one of the things that's really fascinating to watch is how she feathers in this Tadue Furue stuff. I mean, I think she's aware that she's driving you down, she's grinding you, and then she'll give you a little, here's a little Furue to keep going, and then a little stuff, a little switch. There's a Jewish mother. You don't know when it's going to get to the next. You don't know when here's the next gas station. Have some drink now. But anyway, so Tadue Furue, a lean but muscular man of 5 feet 6 inches. So now you get, for the first time, when she's been describing all these other people's bodies, she's now describing his body. He's extremely conscious of his health. And talks about him the way he thinks about him. He's 145 pounds, blah, blah, blah. It makes me, and then he talks about the poor condition of his teeth. Why do his teeth, after he's learned everybody else's teeth, why are his teeth in poor condition? Because he was going to get a thing on the day Pearl Harbor happens, and he never got around to it after that. It's completely wild. And he pulled the two teeth, he had a toothache, he pulled the two teeth himself. And when he looks at Rohrer's index, and when he weighs 143 at 1135, he's somewhere between this guy and this guy. This is mon frère, mon semblable. He's thinking about himself in the terms of these bodies he's looking at. Then it goes, according to Furue's reading of the remains, again, that phrase at the top of 77, and we go on. One of my favorite of those kind of gold nuggets that happens is that thing about fingerprints. That the fingerprints of identical twins are no more alike each other than complete strangers. That's deeply cool. I don't know why that's so cool, but it's just interesting. So we're going along, and did you notice, by the way, at the bottom of 80, one of the people had in his pocket a Honolulu Rapid Transit token stamped good for one full fare and redeemed at that moment? A round-trip ticket in Honolulu, which he has in his pocket. It's pretty amazing. And then we get to that incredible thing where there were the dog tags. You say, what? They're dog tags? And you haven't been paying attention to the dog tags? Are you completely out of your mind? And then he tells you a good reason why you don't pay attention to the dog tags. And people have been, that's the thing that in the brotherly way they would trade each other's dog tags, so you can't pay attention to them at all. And so he goes on, and then we get to, again, the sheer weirdness of this. If he hadn't identified everybody, the people in the CIO were ready to go back and do it all over again into that incredibly insane forest that we've been reading about in the first section. But, so then what happens is that on page 84, he answers, how many have you identified? He answers 22. All right, look at that on page 84 after the line break. So in other words, this whole thing has been, the structure, another way of thinking about the structure of this piece as a whole is that it's all this stuff waiting to get everything identified, and then the moment where it gets identified is here, 22, although it turns out there's going to be an extended kind of passage here before you take off again. And then when we go the other way, it's going to be looking for the people. So everything here is to narrowing down, and everything here will be broadening out. But, so it says, if you look, how many, Doc, how many? There was great rejoicing at the Sea Isle when in late November, Furui was able to answer 22. What's the next sentence? Furui lives. After he's just identified all that death, he lives with his wife. And now for the first time we begin to realize he has a family, whatever it is, and then you get the drunken porter scene. Always at a moment of extreme drama in a piece of writing, you want to have a drunken porter scene, which is in Macbeth, the scene where the most horrible thing has just happened, and then you get this aria of comic fumbling, And in this case, you get him telling about he goes for turkey dinners at the Ginza, and he can't help himself. He always, looks at the wishbone to figure out. I check the epiphyses of the turkey to determine its age when I carve it. It's a professional reflex. It's like very funny to see. But what's interesting is that you now are basically going to have this extended thing. On 89 already, it's saying they have the 22 on January 11th. Webb and Flick, start thinking about it and so forth. But it's really going on and on. There's a long, long period before the story picks up again, and the subtext starts blowing up through here, because this is the point where where great pressure is being put on him to identify the unknown, to claim that somebody is an unknown soldier in Vietnam, and he doesn't want to do it. And there's great pressure from the Reagan administration. The subtext all through here is serious coping with the dead and with the legacy of the dead, and frivolous coping with the dead. And because Reagan wants to have a ceremony, he's being forced to do this. And in fact, it will show up, if you go look it up, that years later, about 10 years ago, they had to disinter the unknown soldier from Vietnam because he wasn't unknown. They figured out who he was. And everything that Furui had been blocking, and Furui, by the way, loses his job over this. He becomes known as a problem and so forth. But all that's taking place as a subtext here. Continuing. But then we eventually get to, on 97, so all this subtext of Vietnam has been playing around there. And then in 97, the CIL is always under pressure to identify the bodies and so forth. And this is the fulcrum of the piece right here. I mean, it's been kind of tottering along here, but here's where it really takes off, because now you're about to have the opposite. Up till now, it was you were claustrophobically in a room trying to identify 22 people, but now you have to go out in the world and find who the relatives of these people are 40 years later. So things begin picking up. That article appears, which is where she first gets on the story, or that article there. And there's an AP story, and they begin trying to figure out how to track people down. On page 100, the most useful tool for tracking down next of kin is a telephone directory. Try that, And now what you're about to see is this piece of writing, which I find just incredibly powerful, which is, these are professional life snipers in some profound sense. There are people in the ordinariness of their lives who have people who are gunning for them right now, and they are going to, and the bullet is going to come in the form of a phone call, in the form of a letter. People who have somehow managed to pick up the horror of their lives and have gone on with their lives and are busy in the busyness of their lives. And unbeknownst to them, there are these snipers coming at them. And one by one, you're going to have people being picked off and having incredibly strange emotional reactions to the stuff that they had somehow thought they'd left behind. And these are almost like haiku, frankly, if you ask me. She doesn't do this at great length. Each one is just a little stupid vignette, but some of them get more and more powerful, it seems to me. Reminds me of this exercise that's going on right there reminds me of a great prose poem by W.S. Merwin, which was written for the first Earth Day, by the way, 1970. And it was called Unchopping a Tree. Do any of you know that that great? It's a great text. It begins, it's called Unchopping a Tree. Start with the leaves, the small twigs in the nest that have been shaken, ripped, or broken off by the fall. These must be gathered and attached once again to their respective places. It's not arduous work unless major limbs have been smashed or mutilated. It goes on, and it basically, insanely, in an almost Sheehan-like way, everything you would have to do to unchop a tree. You attach all the small branches, then you bring in heavy equipment, you take the bowl, you put it on the stump, you have to do all kinds of stuff. It goes on in this kind of just do this, and then eventually they get, finally you've done all this stuff. The day comes when it is all restored, even to the moss now dead over the wound. You will sleep badly thinking of the removal of the scaffolding that must begin the next morning. How you will hope for sun in a still day. The removal of the scaffolding or the tackle is not so dangerous, perhaps, to the surroundings as was its installation, but it presents problems. It should be taken from the spot piece by piece as attached and stored at a distance. You've come to accept it there around the tree. The sky begins to look naked as the chains and struts one by one vacate their positions. Finally, the moment arrives when the last sustaining piece is removed and the tree stands again on its own. It's as though its weight for a moment stood on your heart. You listen for a thud of settlement, a warning creak deep in the intricate joinery. You cannot believe it will hold. How like something dreamed it is standing there all by itself. How long will it stand there now? The first breeze that touches its dead leaves all seem to flow into your mouth. Think about that sentence. Like the first breeze that touches its dead leaves all seem to flow into your mouth. That does not scan as a sentence. There's something wrong with that sentence, but it's what's wrong with the whole problem. I mean, this is insane. It's a dead tree. It's still a dead tree, but you're afraid the motion of the clouds will be enough to push it over. What more can you do? What more can you do? But there's nothing more you can do. Others are waiting. Everything is going to have to be put back. So this is the everything is going to have to be put back brigade, contacting everybody around. And it's the different relatives, the relatives of Raymond Geiss, who we've gotten to know, the co-pilot. There's that wonderful moment on page 104 where they've been looking for one of the ladies, and Maria answers the telephone. Do you have the radio on, Helen asks. No, Mrs. Ulrich said. I'm watching the Idiot Box. Are you sitting down? No, I'm in the family room, and the phone down here is on the wall. Well, please do sit down. I don't know whether I should tell you this, whether it's, and then that woman in turn calls the daughter-in-law, I think, and after the neighbor's departure, Maria Ulrich made a call to Carmen Gross. Where the hell have you been? Mrs. Gross inquired, which is like a great title for this whole book, would have been Where the Hell Have You Been? But all these people are just kind of surfacing, and these little epiphanies of sorrow and misery and horror. And also, should it be the mother who gets to bury him or the wife who gets to bury him? And my wife only had him for a few weeks, and and so forth. There's all that going on. There's all the stuff about where things get picked up, where he had a strangely broken arm because he had a basketball injury. We now find out, pages and pages later. There's that amazing one about the woman who, where was it? On page 100. Odd thing about the number 22, he said a few moments later, the plane crashed on March 22nd, 1944, with 22 men on board, and my mother died on March 22nd, 1980. I mean, that's a novel. That this mother kept herself alive to the birthday of her son. Again, but it's not hammered home, it's just there. It's just how the world is. And then it goes on that the one person decides, we eventually, the one who's buried in Missouri, and then we have a few more, and then we come toward the end, and one person gets buried in Honolulu, in the Punch Bowl, and who is that? The pilot. Ulrich gets buried there. So I told you that this is I'll read you one more poem before we come to this section. This is a poem by Wisława Szymborska. At least three of the greatest poets of the 20th century are these mid-century Poles, Czesław Miłosz, Herbert, who I read, and Szymborska is the other one. And here's her poem. Nothing's a gift. Nothing's a gift, it's all on loan. I'm drowning in debts up to my ears. I have to pay for myself, with myself, give up my life for my life. Here's how it's arranged. The heart can be repossessed, the liver too, and each single finger and toe. Too late to tear up the terms. My debts will be repaid, and I'll be fleeced, or more precisely, flayed. I move about the planet in a crush of other debtors. Some are saddled with the burden of pain off their wings. Others must willy-nilly account for every leaf. Every tissue in us lies on the debit side. Not a tentacle or a tendril is for keeps. The inventory, infinitely detailed, implies we'll be left not just empty-handed, but handless too. I can't remember where, when, and why I let someone open this account in my name. And we call the protest against this state of affairs the soul. And it's the only item not included on the list. Anyway, so, and in those precise terms, I would call this a deeply, deeply soulful piece of writing. Or you can replace the word identity with the word. This is a piece of writing about identity, about establishing someone's identity, and about how identity persists even after death. But the question I have for you is, what do you think, I told you this is a three-part piece, what do you think part 3 is? What would you do if you were a reporter and you'd now done these two sections? What would be the next thing to do?
Spend time with families.
You would spend time with the families, that would be one possibility, yeah? Yeah? Well, it's interesting you say that. Would you profile the 22 men? I'll tell you what she does. And this is in the Asperger's Hall of Fame for something insane to do. The last section of the book, that thick, is called Pilot. And she figures out a way to do a biography of Allred. This nobody who died, who just died. I mean, she reports this guy's life 40 years after he died with incredible intensity. And as you read it, it has a little bit of the quality of the Bridget St. Louis Ray, because one by one, all these people whose names you've gotten to know, you haven't really been focusing, but he ends up, going to pilot school, and people begin to join his crew, and you start to see these people's names. And in fact, there's a really close guy to him that's going all the way through. And on the eve of the flight, will get off the plane because he has a cold. And you're wondering, I don't remember that name, and it turns out he got off and then there's another person whose name you haven't seen who gets on just to hitch a ride. I mean, you have this incredible power of this building thing. And I will read you the last page, because indeed it takes you right up to the funeral of Robert Allred's on March 3rd, 1983. His family's there in the punch bowl. Juanita Beck, remember, I think is his wife or former wife. She tried to make arrangements with a florist in Honolulu to deliver flowers to her husband's grave 3 times a year, on Bob's birthday, at Christmas, and on the anniversary of the crash. But the arrangements didn't work out. Long before she gave up on the florist in late 1984 and started using the services of Florist Trans World Delivery, she learned that someone had succeeded where she had failed. A friend of Louise's took a trip to Hawaii in May 1983 and saw multicolored flowers at Bob Allred's grave. A year later, Paul Allred, 19, the oldest son of Howard's oldest son, spent a semester, and Paul Allred and came up one day, and in a flower container near the headstone was a bouquet of long-stemmed roses. And a man standing nearby. Paul Allred waited until the man turned toward him and then introduced himself, whereupon the man introduced himself. His name was Tadeo Furore. Robert Allred was the first man Furore had identified at the CIL to be buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. And after the funeral service was over, he had made a point of paying his respects to Robert Allred's family. Ferruy had told Paul how much it had meant to him to meet Bob Allred's former wife, his sisters and brother, and his nephews, and now to meet him, his grandnephew. He said that he had brought 22 roses, one for each man on the plane. Tadeu Ferruy visits Bob Allred's grave at least twice a year. He keeps a gallon of water in the trunk of his car. If the radiator leaks, he wants to be prepared to fill it. Classic. And also a roll of paper towels. He has used them to wipe his hands after tightening a battery cable or changing a flat tire. On his visits, he always cleans the headstone and always brings flowers. Number 41081 had been Tadeu Ferruy's most difficult and time-consuming case. As it happened, it had also taken him longer to piece together the remains of Robert Allred than any other person on the plane. And if you think about it, obviously he was in the front of the plane when the plane went to the mountain, which is why that would have been the case. Because Ferruy accepts sole responsibility for each identification he makes, he has a special feeling for Robert Allred. As the commander of the aircraft, Robert Allred had chosen the course. He bore the responsibility for the planes meeting the mountain. Let me read you two other poems, and then I'll read you one other thing, and then we'll take a break. Linda Gregg, The Precision. There's a modesty in nature, in the small of it and in the strongest. The leaf moves just the amount the breeze indicates and nothing more. In the power of lust, too, there can be a quiet and a clarity, a fusion of exact moments. There is a silence of it inside the thundering. And when the body swoons, it's because the heart knows its truth. There is directness and equipoise in the fervor, just as the greatest turmoil has precision. Like the discretion a tornado has when it tears down building after building, house by house, it is enough, Kafka said, that the arrow fit exactly into the wound that it makes. I think about my body in love as I look down on these lavish apple trees and the workers moving with skill from one to the next, singing. And then Marie Howe, a poem called The Last Time, from a book of hers of AIDS poems. The last time we had dinner together in a restaurant with white tablecloths, he leaned forward and took my hands in his hands and said, "I'm going to die soon. I want you to know that." And I said, "I think I do know." And he said, "What surprises me is that you don't." And I said, "I do." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Know that you're going to die." And he said, "No, I mean that you are." Which seems me what that whole Susan Sheen piece is about, too. And then finally, in answer to your question, I wanted to read you a little bit of how the next thing she wrote, The Schizophrenic. And this one, the Pulitzer Prize, actually. There's no place on earth for me. I just want to read you the beginning. And then we'll take a break. Shortly after midnight on Friday, June 16, 1978, Sylvia Frumpkin decided to take a bath. Actually, it occurs to me, this was the piece she published before. So this is immediately before, but the one you just read. Shortly after midnight on Friday, June 16, 1978, Sylvia Frumpkin decided to take a bath. Miss Frumpkin, a heavy, ungainly young woman who lived in a two-story yellow brick building in Queens Village, New York, walked from her bedroom on the second floor to the bathroom next door and filled the tub with warm water. A few days earlier, she had had her hair cut and shaped in a bowl style, which she found especially becoming, and her spirits were high. She washed her brown hair with shampoo and also with red mouthwash. Some years earlier, she had tinted her hair red, and she liked the way it looked then. She had given up wearing her hair red only because she had found coloring it every 6 weeks too much of a bother. She imagined that the red mouthwash would somehow be absorbed into her scalp and make her hair red permanently. Miss Frumpkin felt so cheerful about her new haircut that she suddenly thought that she was Lori Lamaris, the mermaid who Clark Kent had met in college and had fallen in love with in the old Superman comics. She blew bubbles into the water. After a few minutes of contented frolicking, Miss Frumpkin stepped out of the tub. She slipped on the bathroom floor. It was wet from her bubble blowing and splashing, and cut the back of her head as she fell. The cut began to bleed. She attempted to stop the bleeding by applying pressure to the cut, then wrapped her head in a large towel and walked back to her bedroom. On the dresser was a bottle of expensive perfume that an aunt and an uncle had given her in May as a 30th birthday present. She poured the contents of the bottle on her cut, partly because she knew that perfume contained alcohol and that alcohol was an antiseptic. In 1972, Miss Frumpkin had completed a 10-month course qualifying as a medical secretary, and partly because she suddenly thought that she was Jesus Christ and that her bleeding cut was the beginning of a crown of thorns. She also thought that she was Mary Magdalene, who had poured ointment on Christ. And it goes on from there. And it's 200 pages like that. Pretty amazing lady, our friend Susan Sheen. Anyway,
Was she a writer? I mean, really, she wasn't a writer before or something?
I mean, she must have been. I mean, she was a voice. But I'm going to leave this here for you to look at. Oops, stop it. So we'll take a break, look at this. I mean, she clearly became a writer right away and is a quite amazing writer and an amazing reporter. And the other thing I mentioned is that I have right there from last week the Canal Street with Saul Steinberg's illustrations. A very rare. What did we decide? 160 copies of this book exist? 160 copies of that book exist in the world. So be gentle. Okay. Let's begin to get back together. I realized there was something I forgot to tell you about. Remember, I was telling you that the thing that's amazing about that image is that. Hear yourself. The thing that's amazing about that image is the way in which those three guys are all looking at his hand. Except it's really, really funny and you don't really see this unless you're actually looking at the painting. And if you're standing in front of the painting, you are absolutely at eye level of this guy here. And you suddenly realize that one of his eyes is looking at the professor's hand, and the other eye is looking at the flayed arm. And it's a movie. He's going, watch as I pull back. You'll see what I mean. Look at the two eyes. One eye is looking down, and the other eye is looking at the hand. Isn't that weird? Those Dutch. Let's see, a few other announcements. Reminding you about the really wonderful event we're going to have on October 29th. This thing about Curzio Malaparte and Vasily Grossman, two of the greatest writers of the 20th century, but also reporting on the Eastern Front from opposite sides of the Eastern Front, an Italian fascist and a Jewish communist. And then, just so you know, the other piece of paper right there is for the Halloween Wonder Cabinet that I'm going to be throwing. And it is all day long Halloween, and there's nothing you can do in life better than this. They're just completely weird, nutty, jaw-dropping, strange things, and you are forewarned, and if you miss it, you have only yourself to blame. So, yeah, why don't you take and just pass those around everybody? So there's that. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, as you see, I have a cane. This is because I threw my back, and it now looks like I'm going to have surgery next Monday on my back. Not terribly serious surgery. I'm not even sure that I'm going to have it. I may not have it, but for the sake of discussion, I think we better assume that I am going to have it, which means that I will postpone we'll push back. I won't be here next Monday, and we'll send out a notice to everybody. And what I think I will do, rather than completely mess everybody up, is that I'll do, when we come back the following week, I'll do Joe Gould's Secret the following week, which is where it is supposed to be on the schedule. And for that, you have to go buy the book. It's at Shakespeare and Company, up in the old hotel, and it's wonderful. And then the following week, I'll pick up the missed one, which I think is November 2nd, whatever, the Monday afterwards. So I'm sorry about that, and if you know people who are taking this, try to get word to them, and we'll post it and so forth. And the craziest part of this is I was virtually certain I was going to have surgery a couple days ago, and now I'm doing anything I may not need it, but we might as well just do this cleanly and not have to be getting in touch with everybody at the last minute. So there's that. And I was just going to mention also, a stitch that I dropped was just talking about Neil Sheehan's book. Have any of you read A Bright Shining Line? It really is one of the most amazing. It is absolutely the book that Melville would have written about Vietnam, and it focuses on this one maniacal character who's somewhat like McChrystal today. Except he was lower in the pecking order, but all the 1961, 62, 63 correspondents hung out with him. He was a gangbuster. He's also kind of a prototype of the Marlon Brando character in Apocalypse Now, and he's incredibly intense, incredibly driven, totally ignored. Everything goes to hell. He comes back to America. His life goes to hell, and he follows him to America and trying to figure out what the riddle of this drivenness is. And it turns out to be very, very dark stuff. I mean, the guy was himself molested as a child and probably was a child molester himself, and Vietnam was all about getting away from all that horrible stuff. Reminds me of this, the best description I ever read of Vietnam was in Norman Mailer. He has this wonderful description at one point where he says, this is during the war itself, talking about the bombing of Hanoi that was taking place at that moment. And he was saying, it would be as if a man left his home in the suburbs every evening, crossed the lawn, got out on the street, walked for hours and hours, walked to some completely different neighborhood, walked up the streets to a particular house, all was the same house, found the front lawn of the house, pulled down his pants and shat on that lawn. Surely this wouldn't go on. Surely at some point he'd be stopped. Surely he'd be picked up by the police, and as he was being dragged away, he would be yelling, but I have to, I've been bitten by a bat. Any other writer would say America's behavior is rabid, but this is like the operatic version of that. I have to, I've been bitten by a bat. On that note, let's turn to my grandfather. I wanted to spend a little while with you on this other piece. Again, we're talking about form and formfulness, but this is a piece that I wrote about my grandfather. I think I told you at the beginning I have very thick skin, so if you didn't like this, did you like this, Art?
Not only did I like it, I think you coupled it with the Sheehan piece, so I liked it even more.
Well, see, Art's easy. But if anybody else didn't like it, I have no problem with that. I'd be happy to talk about it. The main reason I assign these is so I can talk about the process where I can tell you factually why I did things. Any immediate thoughts on this piece? By the way, if you like it, it's okay too. This is funny. I think this is a piece where the New Yorker was going to have an all-music issue, and one of Tina's people came down to me and said, "We're having an all-music issue. We know your grandfather was a composer. You've got to write a piece about it." And all through the planning for this issue, the intellectual spine of this issue is going to be Weschler's piece. It's coming together. It's going to be Weschler's piece, and da-da-da. And then, like a week before they went to press, they killed it. And one of Tina's people one of the Tinettes, as we used to call them, came downstairs and said, "We feel we owe you an explanation for why we had to kill the piece. It just wasn't any good." Okay, well, I guess it just never quite worked. I guess not. So I picked up the phone and called Bill Whitworth at the Atlantic, and he bought it 10 minutes later. and so this is where it ran. But anyway, so this is a piece that begins. One of the things I used to like about, I think I talked about this, is what I liked about old-style New Yorker pieces is that they didn't seem to be about anything at all in particular, and sheer narrative energy would get you into them, and about halfway through you'd realize they were about the most important thing in the world. But, I mean, this is literally, if you want to conjure a reader's attention, tell them a fairy tale. And this just starts with, and you have no idea why you're reading this. What the Scheherazade? What? This, that. And the piece goes along. I'm telling the story of Scheherazade, and then this little surprise thing there at the very end. Scheherazade, having given her all, had indeed told one tale too many. Utterly spent, she collapsed, pale and depleted, into his arms, and opera being opera, proceeded to die. There's a wonderful book, feminist critique of opera, called 37 Ways to Kill a Woman. It's really weird. I mean, the history of opera is basically the history of these male composers killing off women all the time. And so, but anyway, so now the Atlantic put subheads, but I just had Roman numerals there in what followed. And so in terms of the form here, in my own thinking about it anyway, there's and then there's 4 sections. And the 4th section has a kind of coda at the end, which begs the question of what is the form of this piece, and without pushing, it's a symphonic form, basically. Although with a little curly cue at the beginning, it has an overture, and in much the way an opera has an overture, all the themes that will later be in the piece are compacted in those first few paragraphs. Tyranny, exile, love, blockage, release, all those kinds of things that will be played through the whole thing are in that overture, and not surprisingly, because that is the piece that at the end of his life, the libretto that he gloms onto as somehow speaking him and really summarizing his life. So in a way, it's not, by the end, it won't be surprising that that was the case. But, so you have this whole overture, which has all the themes roiling around, and this is, if you were looking back at the Sandy Fraser, all that kind of manic energy is all here. And now we're going to kind of begin to move it through. And so opera being opera proceeds to die, and then I begin picking up right here with opera. So this was indeed an opera. Not only that, it's my grandfather's opera, and I proceed in the first movement to talk about my relationship with my grandfather, the fact that he'd never heard of Sandy Koufax, that it was his, in much the way that it was as appalling that he'd never heard of Sandy Koufax, it's equally appalling that he was stuck with me as his executor, since I didn't know a thing about music and I was completely hopeless at it. I am so hopeless at music that I am a case study in Oliver Sacks's musicophilia. I don't know if you can. He has a whole 2 paragraphs about he can't believe how pathetic I am, but he says, he seems to be an intelligent person. He's completely pathetic. But anyway, so there's all that going on. There's the stuff about my grandmother's oral history. One of the things you can't really see very well, but I love how he's, in this picture, holding this weird little marmot or something, and then he's holding me in exactly the same grip in this down here. And so I'm just describing how complete, the first movement is all about me and him and how completely hopeless I am, and I've been trying to get this work premiered, and I'm completely hopeless. I can't get it done at all. It doesn't work. And finally, I get this thing from the German-Serbian folk theater, at which I say, this and that sound altogether good for the Jews, which is where we end this thing right here. And you'll notice formally what happens is that the next thing in part 2, that they were both born in Vienna, my grandparents, and they were both Jewish. And now we're going to start talking about, so there's that thing there, but you are now not going to hear, this is a little bit similar to McPhee leaving the Genophiles out in the blue. You're not going to hear about this opera production for the next 2 sections. We'll get back to it later on, but so that in fact there's going to be this business happening later on. But now that you're going to have this little mini story, which is basically the biographical story with him. And again, I'm trying to describe to you how I'm thinking about this formally, trying to give order to all this kind of stuff. And it seems to me that basically the piece has a double fulcrum. This is kind of like one of those pieces that like those teeter-totters that go flat for a second and then they bump and then they go flat and they bump. You'll notice that there's going to be 2 fulcrums to the piece. I basically divide the piece at his exile, basically. You know, that there's his life before exile and his life after exile. But, you know, I tell the whole story, and then you get to the first fulcrum, which is that Egon and Emily opera, where it's an opera which is the exact opposite of the Scheherazade opera. It's the opera where the soprano and her tuxedoed boyfriend come out, and she starts singing and singing and singing, and cannot get him to sing, and finally collapses, leaves, and he just says he doesn't like opera anyway. I mean, it's the opposite because of the other one. She can't sing. Her problem is she has no more tales to tell here. She doesn't have anybody to tell it to. But in case, then I say at the end of that end of opera, curtain fall, and indeed that's the beginning where I start talking about this incredible meteoric career that had suddenly gone bad with the comings of the Nazis fairly soon afterwards, and it goes on for a bit. But basically, he leaves. He sends that telegram. I have my pencil, and it goes forward. And then I would suggest that the other fulcrum point comes where he has his heart attack. And then, in fact, in some way, in 1948, after the war, so that in some ways his life is divided in half. In another sense, his life is divided in three. He has this meteoric rise, he has this terrible blockage, and then after the heart attack, he starts composing again, culminating in the opera. But so this is very consciously, there's these two movements, but there's this break there and there, and so and in musical terms, you know, as you can imagine, it's two against three. And I mean, there's all these, as I say at one point, I have all kinds of musical metaphors in my head. It's not that I don't think musically, in fact, I think compositionally, and I can describe to you how these four line up against these two and line up against those three, and all that stuff, and how that is entirely musical conception. I just can't play the piano. And it's worse than that. I think I tell them the story of the piece about, it's really funny, by the way, because there's going to be a big show of my grandfather's in Vienna this coming summer, a show about him. And so they've been contacting us to get home movies and so forth, and I've been going through home movies. And I found the home movie of his coming out of his study with the little piece that he'd written for my brother and me, and sitting down and whistling it. And because it's, you know, 8mm, you can't actually hear him doing it. But I have the piece memorized in my head, and I can sing it for you, and it's a canon, and what I can't do is play it out, plump it out on the piano. I think I say it, do I say here, that what I can't do is, I cannot tell you the first four notes of the Fifth Symphony, whether it goes up or down. Da-da-da-da. To me, I think it goes up, but everybody tells me it goes down, so I know it intellectually goes down, but I cannot hear that. And with this piece my grandfather wrote, and it's a canon. But the point is, if I'm at a piano, I cannot, I go don't. I can, you know, if hit and miss, I'll find it, but it's like really weird. It's the same thing. I cannot scan poetry. You know, people who will say, "Oh yeah, that's two dactyls and a iamb," and you know, there are people who just love doing the dump and I cannot hear that at all. As you know, I love poetry, but I can't hear. So he knows. Anyway, that's, you know, altogether more than you need to know about me. But it's because of that I can't. Now, what's fascinating, parenthetically, is that since I wrote this piece, there's been this huge resurgence of his music. There have been like 20 CDs in the last 5 years, mainly in Germany, and I have nothing to do with it, but it's kind of weird. And so, I was just telling you very quickly, but I think I have another piece, that's the piece that he then, 4 months later, we're presented to him, my brother and I, and he turns to my grandmother and says, "Well, the younger one maybe, but the older one is the most pathetic." I can't believe it. It's so sad. And I suddenly had no more pressure to do piano lessons, which is great. Anyway, just continuing. So I continue to tell his story, and this ends up being his life story, ending in 1964, just after he's finished the opera. you begin to understand why that opera would have mattered to him, and so forth. And then the last movement begins, the German-Serbian folk theater in Bautzen. To begin with, it turned out to be Sorbian. This is the famous Emily Latella move. Oh, never mind. What's all this I hear about flea erections? Why should we care whether fleas have erections? It's crazy. Leave them alone. Free elections. Ah, never mind. Never mind. That's it. I'm dating myself. But anyway, Gilda Radner, Saturday Night Live. Okay. First years. What's all this I hear about free elections? Anyway, so it turns out, on the one hand, I'm all wrong. I completely misunderstood what was being said. But then it turns out that this is even weirder than I thought, because it turns out that Bautzen is first of all, a huge Nazi criminal town, a town of Penal Town, and then it turns out it was one of the worst places in East Germany. And that's completely weird. And so it's just, so there's a kind of, oh, never mind, on second thought, mind. Wait a second, this is like really weird what's going on here. And so I'm there, but at the same time, there's this guy, Poch, who has decided to do it, and you'll notice that on page 105, I signal what's coming. I say that he was somewhat frail, and that's going to turn out to be important toward the end. And they're doing the thing, and I have my nervous breakdown, sitting in this room full of Germans who resolutely refuse to realize this is about them. I think I've started. They often have concerts of his music in Berlin these days, and I'm invited to go talk at them, and I'll do this whole thing about how, when he was here in Berlin in the 20s, it was incredible. There were all these symphonies, and every night there were 3 symphonies, 4 operas, chamber music, incredible. This echo chamber was, incredible place, and then he goes to America, and, it's like the vast echoless expanses, and like there's nothing there, and all the there's like, it's completely, but at least there they weren't trying to kill him. And I'm having that strange reaction in the room, which is, if you think about it, exactly his reaction. I mean, the love of Germany and the horror of Germany. And on the one hand, I do it the flip side of it. I just said, getting the heebie-jeebies that these people are oblivious. On the other hand, these are the people who have that culture. Is there anything like this in America? This is really moving. This is powerful. And that in turn leads to that last paragraph. The next night, though, for some reason, things did seem simpler. Maybe I was just being lifted higher by the music as I grew more familiar with it. The vexing political context seemed to fall away, and as Scheherazade struggled through her blockage and into her transporting narrative, I experienced an overwhelming sense that my grandfather had drawn together all the disparate themes of his own life in one transcendent summary exaltation. Things that had seemed chopped and broken and scattered, the charge of both his life and his music, were retrospectively realigning and resolving themselves. As Scheherazade's last aria reached its lyrical climax, I found myself remembering a letter Toch had written to a young would-be composer not long after his own heart attack. By the way, what do you think of that letter? The funny thing about that letter is it is the most devastating and the most generous letter simultaneously. It's really kind of amazing. I did look up the Kansas City death records to see whether this guy committed suicide. Nicholas Ledemsky, who I did a profile of, died at 101 and a half, but he was the great musical lexicographer and the great keeper of the crypt. And he and I went investigating Kansas City moorings and so forth to find out when this guy survived this letter, but apparently he did. He then went on actually to teach at a conservatory in Kansas City. But it just seems to me so much is amazing in that letter. And specifically, what I love in that letter is one of the things I talk about all the time, the architectonic. That music, that writing is much closer to music than it is to painting, than painting is, for example, because it takes place across time. And that it is the sequential exposition of material across time. And parenthetically, my grandfather's book, The Shaping Forces in Music, I think I mentioned to you that I'm hopeless. In the book, I talk about how, I mean, it's all like this kind of stuff, you know. It's all these musical examples, and I can't read this. I don't know what he's talking about. But the text is, I know everything he's talking about. And the chapters, and I absolutely recommend this for anybody who wants to be a writer. But the shaping forces in music are harmony, melody, counterpoint, and form. In the chapter, you know, things like the art of joining, how to begin and end, motif and theme, movement, you know, all this kind of stuff is exactly stuff you think about. His chapters on those things are completely what you'd want to know. The book was a Dover book. It's now out of print, but you can easily find it on you know, at used bookstores.
Did you think of your writing, that passage where you say you have your translated pieces in your mind?
I'll show you that. I'll show you actually how that works in a second. No, not that. No, but the notion of formfulness, the notion of architectonic, i.e., building architecture across time rather than across space, but the pressures of constriction, widening, high, low, I mean, all that stuff you think about all the time when you're a writer. And motifs, in the same way that in architecture, a certain theme here, gets repeated there. I mean, all that's something to think about. And then what I love in this place is he makes it organic. He gives you the sense in which a tree is also an architectonic across time. It slowly builds up, and it builds up into a structure, and the sap has to flow through it rather than being patched, as he says at one point about this completely mismatched mess that the guy sent him with the trouser legs attached to the collar and the, you know, and so forth. So anyway, I mean, I'm very aware of that in my writing. And in fact, this, if you think about what's happening, reading you that last section, I would suggest that what happens here is that all this gets like this, and then it kind of gets sent through here, and then it goes like this, and then at the end, it all gets pulled. It's all being pulled together, so that in the same way it took off like that, it's being pulled. I'll read you the last sentences again and give you a sense that, and this seems to be very musical, just pulling this together. There must be no seams, no gaps, no form. A composition must grow organically like a tree, he had urged the young man to understand. There must be no seams, no gaps, no foreign matter. The sap of the tree must pass through the whole body of it, reach every branch and twig and leaf of it. It must grow instead of being patched. I could see that Tach had been talking not only about the composition of a piece of music, but also the composition of a life, and for that matter, of a family line. And as the audience now rose in ovation, showering particular kudos on their beloved Pach, by the way, is that weird, Pach? I can't write this stuff. Anyway, who stood there drained and pale, trembling in his triumph, for as none of us realized at the time, he was already riddled with a cancer that would claim his life within a few months. This was going to be his last tale, too. I found myself realizing how for Ernst, the spiritual challenge was the same in both instances, life and work. I suddenly recalled some lines from one of the last notes he'd ever written to Lily, the one with which Scheherazade-like she had chosen to conclude her oral history before herself going on to die. It consisted of a poem in which he acknowledged all the sacrifices she had made in his behalf over the 50 years of their life together, assuring her that he was aware of the suffering such sacrifices had often entailed, and an awareness that was his despair. Yet he begged her forgiveness. It couldn't be helped, for as he and she, and now I, included by way of explanation, geschrieben, I do not press, I am pressed. I do not write, I am written. And if you think about telling tales at the outset and whether you can or you can't tell a tale, and whether you write or you don't write, and who was doing the writing, who was doing the telling, especially in the context of Scheherazade, the person who does the telling is my grandfather at the end of the day. So that's all meant to kind of tie up together like that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
point do you see this?
At what point do I see that? Well, it's a little bit like the story I told you about McPhee. Going, huh. I mean, what generally happens with me is, and I'll talk about this more when we get to talking about, in 2 weeks when we talk about Joe Gould's Secret, we'll talk about writer's block. But I have all the stuff on the table. I index my notes insanely. When I show you that, when we talk about the Breitenbach piece, and now in 3 weeks, I'll bring in my notes, my index of my notes for a Breitenbach piece. But it's just, I index the stuff like crazy. And while I'm indexing, I'm trying to figure out some stuff. But during the blockage, usually what's happening is I'm trying to figure out what the form is. And I do have blotter-like pieces of paper, and I'm making drawings, and I'm doing all kinds of things. And I would think it was, I knew how I was going to begin with that Scheherazade story just because it was such a great story. And I knew pretty much where I wanted to end up, and I knew how it had to do that. Somewhere in there I came up with the idea of a symphonic model, and then somewhere in there the idea of doing the two parts of his life. But I think that is what you're trying to do always with a piece of long form writing. You are trying to figure out what the form is, and it's not you figure out the form before you do the writing. As you are working on it, at what point did the tree begin to realize it was going to take that shape? I mean, it just does at some point. But anyway, we'll keep asking that kind of question as we go through, because it's the same question you ask with all the pieces. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about, I was struck as when I brought in this heart frame pole.
Yeah.
And I was, when I was first reading it, when I first thought there was going to be a breakdown in the home, I was worried because okay, it's already your story, your grandfather's story, the music, but that it was really useful.
Uh-huh.
The words in that poem were really useful. And I was wondering if in terms of construction, how when will those tensions and you bring in other material, when do you find that most useful and not?
Well, as you can see, I do it all the time in class. I'm always reading poetry, and when I teach my longer class, it's half for graduate journalism students and half for graduate, largely poets, which is hilarious, by the way, when it happens. It's just really weird. But I'm basically creating investigative poets. And I'm trying to create a little bit more lyrical journalism students. But something I do myself, which I think is a little bit unusual, is I am open to anything being thrown into the middle of the story. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to show you Vermeer's, Rembrandt, and I tend to do that a bit more than other people do. I have a whole book that's kind of, Everything That Rises, which is nothing but this. But did I tell you the story about when I graduated from college and the shrink that we had a family friend who was a shrink, and he said, come over, you graduate for you. My grandmother, when asked what I was studying in college, said nothing that will bring him any good. And so I show up after 4 years in Santa Cruz, and this guy says, "Well, do some tests. We'll figure out, what you should be when you grow up." So we did the test, the 800 questions. I'd rather be a arsonist or a fireman. I'd rather be a rock or a plant. I'd rather be, they do that one, and they do the Rorschach test, and they do all the. So at the end of the testing, it was like half an afternoon. He said, "Well, come back in 2 weeks and we'll talk about it." So I come back in 2 weeks. He says, "Well, first thing I have to say to you is that Rorschach tests are graded on different indices. And one of the indices is just free association, free associative tendencies. And I've called 15 of my colleagues about you. You are so far off the chart, no one has ever seen a reading like this, and this is not good. This is not going to be good for you." Part of my life has been cobbling together a life where I could continue to do this to some extent, but I just never accepted that you don't do that. I mean, it seems to me if there's a poem, of course you put the poem in there. And you need to get to, I mean, I have a book called Vermeer in Bosnia. You're not going to understand Bosnia unless you understand, you know, Vermeer. I mean, that's obvious to me. And other people seem to think it's weird. But having said that, if I could give you something, I would give you permission to do it too. You know. And by the way, often you'll take it out at the end, but it was something that helped you. It helped you get your grip on some ideas.
Do you have this moment where you include, when you're writing, including those influences in your work and then going back and thinking those thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, occasionally, yeah, I mean, there's another lesson I would teach you is that revision isn't cleaning up after the party. Revision is the party. At a certain point, you get it out there, and then you start doing the polishing and so on. That's actually a lot of fun. But having said that, contradicting myself, I tend to spend so much time in blockage that when I finally write, first draft is final copy. But even so, I will polish it some, and things, you know, they'll kill your children kind of thing, you know, kill your lovelies, you know, the things that you really like you have to get rid of. But I thought I would do just a few more minutes just to show you that I'm not making this up about my grandfather and his music and how it plays in my head. I thought I would play, if I can do this. Let's see if I can. I'm going to go to iTunes, and I will play you the. Let's see here. Okay, here it is. I will play for you the beginning of the piano concerto, and this is I ripped this off completely in the overture of the piece. So this is let's see how this goes here. Okay, let's pure plot, absolutely pure. Scheherazade this, she then did this, she did then this. It had already spent, she collapsed pale and depleted into his arms, and opera being opera, proceeded to die. And now you'll see the orchestra starting. Now look, the orchestra is doing the same thing in much the way that it's doing in alternate here. So it goes on from there. And the Seventh Symphony, by contrast, I'll just let this go for a second. And it goes on from there. The ending of the whole piece is the ending of the Seventh Symphony, which is the last symphony. I'll just play you that. to the last paragraph. You can almost feel the as he said, and she said, and I said, by way of explanation. And here we go into italics. I do not write, I am written, I do not put. Always end with Spangle, that's how I speak. No, stop it. No, be quiet. Shut up. Now, anyway, so that, see, do you see how that, and I really wasn't aware I was doing that, but I was what was playing in my head at the end. If you humor me, I'll want to hear the Geographical Fugue, but I'll play you a really funny version. This is a recent version of the Geographical Fugue by a Caribbean gospel choir in Montreal. What's funny about that piece, of course, is that that's my grandfather horning on my territory. That's its words, you know. That's my stuff. What's funny? There's all kinds of things that are funny about that piece. Years later, if you go to Three Penny Review's website, I wrote a piece about this on Three Penny Review in their reading room. You can find it. I mean, this is 30 years ago. I was producing a recording of this, and in those days, you know, when you were in the recording booth, you know, you do 30 takes with the chorus, and then you take it back, and It literally was with Scotch tape, with tape, you know, it was all that, it wasn't, it was computer stuff, it was tape, and, you know, you take the titty from one side of the caca from another, and then, you know, sculpt this thing together with 85 cuts, you know, and put it together. And I was just going out of my mind with boredom because I felt solidarity had to be there with it. So I ended up writing a medical fugue. And it had, so, syphilis. By the way, Trinidad, in the German, it's Ratibor, because you need to be above a, in English, Ratibor doesn't work, because doesn't work, but so you need a Trinidad, but syphilis works. Syphilis at the end. Syphilis and the tight tendinitis and the pig trichinosis and the clap gonorrhea. But here's the hard one. The Popocatépetl is not in Canada, rather in Mexico. The psychosomatical, arduous, hysterical, and not reliable line. Rickets. Stamina, famine, and muscular dystrophy. Stamina, famine, and muscular dystrophy. Or it can be stamina, famine, or immunodeficiency. Anyway, it gets crazy. There's just one last cue piece. I'll just play one last. We have a minute for. This is a piece that he wrote kind of for me, a circus overture. He loved taking me to the circus, so this is his version of the circus. This is a really old recording. And I think about it, that's probably what that looks like too, if you were to map it out. It wasn't coming out the other end. Anyway, okay, enough of that. So I will not be here next week. The following week we read Joe Gould's Secret. I think Joseph Mitchell's Joe Gould's Secret. I think I mentioned to you that when we get there, we are no longer doing literature, we're doing theology, because there's no accounting for how any human being could have written this piece of work. And it is, I can find you 20 writers who you love who will say that it is the greatest piece of narrative nonfiction in the history of American English in the 20th century. And that's putting it mildly. So that's a lot of fun. And then the following week we'll go back and look at the freedom stuff that I wanted to talk about.